Welcome to the Middle East Forum's panel on Islamism in the 2020 US elections. My name is Benjamin Baird, and I am the Associate Director of the Islamism and Politics Project. For the next hour, we will discuss the political rise of American Islamists who have become increasingly involved in American politics. Joining me today is our panel of experts, and together we will discuss Islamist campaign contributions, the 2020 presidential race, and Qatar's attempts to meddle in US politics. Finally, our guest speaker will talk about the challenges of running a political campaign against a Muslim American candidate with strong Islamist support. With less than 2 weeks before Election Day, most Americans remain uninformed about the political activities of Muslim Americans and the interference of foreign Islamist regimes. The Islamism and Politics Project of the Middle East Forum was established to not only educate the public about this threat, but to challenge and counter Islamist political organizing at the local and national level. Although Americans of any ethnicity or religion should be encouraged to engage in the political process, Muslim Americans are led and mobilized by lawful Islamists. Now, when we say lawful Islamists, we are referring to a subset of Muslims who believe that Islam or Islamic law should play a central role in public life. At the Middle East Forum, we believe that lawful Islamists pose a more dangerous threat to democratic societies than terrorists and jihadists who lack public support for their violent methods and face opposition from government agencies around the world. Islamists currently dominate the political scene for Muslims in the US. This is because they have a history of providing social welfare services to Muslim Americans, and therefore they have the organizational capacity to run mosques and nonprofits, which can then be used to mobilize voters to pursue their agenda. What is the Islamist agenda? Well, they pursue a variety of legislation, and none of it is good for America. Islamists want to erode America's borders and open it up to unfettered immigration from Muslim-majority countries. They want to undermine counterterrorism investigations, resisting efforts to monitor air travel, and even working to free Islamists accused of providing financial support to jihadist groups. They seek to demonize Israel and the government of India, referring to each as apartheid states while sympathizing with the terrorist resistance. Islamists claim that they have no interest in imposing Sharia law in America. Yet they openly resist efforts by state legislatures to ban it. In fact, in states like Minnesota, Islamists are trying to secure interest-free home loans for Muslim citizens in accordance with Sharia finance. Other Muslim civil society organizations representing different national groups, such as Turkish and Iranian Americans, these groups advocate on behalf of foreign Islamist regimes, working to undermine sanctions or, for instance, limit presidential war powers. And finally, Islamists seek to punish any criticism of Islam by citing Islamophobia, using victim politics as political currency to buttress and reinforce their extremist agenda. By engaging in identity politics, Islamists have become natural allies of the American left and the Democratic Party, despite in many cases espousing strict conservative beliefs about family, marriage, and sexuality. To realize this agenda, Islamists are politically organizing like never before. They're holding massive get out the vote drives, fielding dozens of Islamist candidates, organizing Muslim Day lobbying events in state capitals, raising money through donor clubs and PACs, and drafting Islamist legislation at rates never before experienced. So I provided a general overview of Islamist electioneering, but our panel will elaborate on each of these topics over the next hour. We will follow this up with approximately 10 minutes of questions from myself before opening the panel up to questions from our audience during the final 10 minutes. Let's start by briefly introducing our panelists. Our first speaker is Sam Westrop, director of the Forum's Islamist Watch project. He was formerly research director at Americans for Peace and Tolerance and head of Stand for Peace, a London-based counter-extremism organization. Sam has spent many weeks sorting through Federal Elections Commission data to give us an idea of how Islamists are funding US elections. After I provide a brief presentation on Islamist involvement in presidential politics, our guest speaker, Dalia al-Aqidi, will recount her experience running a counter-Islamist campaign against Representative Ilhan Omar in Minnesota's 5th District. Ms. al-Aqidi is Senior Fellow at the Center for Security Policy and an award-winning journalist. So without further ado, let's hear from Sam Westrop regarding Islamist money in politics. Sam.
Thank you very much, Ben. As Ben mentioned, we've spent quite a while looking through Federal Election Commission data, and after weeks of studying the laws and trying to understand the regulations and going through vast amounts of data that the FEC provides, we're still pretty baffled. But what we can work out from it is pretty interesting. And amid the chaos of American federal finance laws and the exceptionally complicated system of funding and organization that Islamist organizations in this country have set up, we managed to uncover a few sort of summary high-level facts as well as some pretty interesting examples. In total, we uncovered $3 million worth of funding to federal races from American Islamists. To get this data, we iterated through almost 4,000 Islamist connected individuals, went through their names, compared it to FEC data. We also checked against, within the FEC records, filings where employers are listed against a list of Islamist linked or Islamist run institutions. And that's where we get this $3 million figure from. As you might expect, the majority of that is to the Democratic Party, 2.3 million to the Democrats, around 300,000 to the Republicans, and the rest that's unaccounted for went to various PACs with either no particular party loyalty or involved with unknown, smaller, lesser known third parties as well. This is what you'd expect. The Islamists for the last, for the last 20 years have been increasingly aligning themselves with much of the left, originally the liberals, but increasingly the progressivist side. And that bears out in the data. Bernie Sanders took more Islamist money than Joe Biden. Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar took more than Bernie Sanders. Republican money, where it does exist, tends to be from individual businessmen who may have non-Islamist or business interests in making donations. By and large, the data shows what we suspected, that Islamists have embraced the progressivist side of the left, that they are trying to use money to advance that agenda. There's a couple of things that the data doesn't include and that did surprise us. One, the Islamists, and I'm sure other panelists will go into this, Islamists have put a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of effort into fielding their own candidates for this election, for the midterms previously. And our data looked at specifically the last 2 years of funding. We didn't see that the Islamist individuals, Islamist organizations, Islamist PACs, Islamist donor clubs are spending that much money and time on their own candidates. They're mostly donating, if not to major well-known politicians like Ilhan Omar and like Rashida Tlaib, they're donating to larger pools of funding. PACs, Act Blue, the Democratic Congressional Candidate Committee, to donate to Democrats generally. And what we've concluded from this is that the Islamists are spending their time training candidates and advancing their agenda, but not necessarily funding it. They're relying on the extant funding machine that is the Democratic fundraising party, fundraising side, to advance their agenda. They see their job as to get the candidates a foot in the door, and after that they to see how much effect they've had. There are certainly quite a few Islamist candidates in the upcoming elections. There are a number of individual data points that I think are worth mentioning. Firstly, one of the few Republican donations worth mentioning, I think, is Stephen Scalise, Republican Congressional House Whip, took quite a bit of money from Fuad al-Hibri, a very prominent businessman who owns the Al-Hibri Foundation, a very prominent funder of Islamist organizations around the country, including terror-tied groups like Islamic Relief. Again, this could be an example of a non-Islamist issue, or it could be a sign of the growing dissatisfaction within parts of American Islamism over the embrace of the left. Increasingly, a number of Islamists warn that all this progressivism is diluting the purism of, or the purity rather, of Islam, and they're trying to push back and embrace a more conservative approach. You know, they especially with parts of the evangelical community, they say, you know, for a long time, many of our Islamist colleagues have been pretending to endorse LGBT rights in order to get into bed with progressivists. We don't believe in LGBT rights. We don't believe in gay rights. The conservatives are actually more of a natural home for a lot of American Islamism. And there is now a push to do that. It's possible that this growth in Republican donations over the last few years is a symptom of that. It's possible, but again, we cannot be sure. The only other thing I'll mention is the extraordinary amount of money that's coming from Herndon, Virginia. And Herndon, Virginia is home of something called the Safa Network, which was a terror network investigated in the 2000s. The investigation fell through mostly due to political incompetence and interfering. But the organizations that were involved in this terror network, most particularly a group called the Safa Trust, along with a number of the grant-making foundations and other organizations, the people who run those, their family, are all heavy donators to a number of races. Those races tend to be not Islamist candidates, as I said earlier, but mainstream Democrats. But the amount of money they're putting into the Democrats is particularly interesting. We have something like 10,000 data points on this to publish, and it will be appearing on the Middle East Forum website sometime in the next week or so. We need to do a final verification, final cleaning of data, and you're welcome to look through that data yourself. For the moment, I'll leave you with just this thought. Islamism funds the people we'd expect them to fund. They're funding the groups and organizations they've been working with for the last 2 years to oppose Trump, to advance Islam as a victimized minority religion. They are doing what we would I believe, and we don't have the best past data to compare it to, but this is the largest amount of money given by Islamists to Republicans since the 2000s, since before 9/11. So something is clearly changing. I attribute that to changes within internal Islamist politics in America, but I guess at the next midterms, we'll have a little more data. We'll be able to know for sure then. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Sam. I look forward to asking you some follow-on questions in the question portion of our panel. Our next topic, which I will present, we'll take a look at Islamist influence in the 2020 presidential race. I'm of course talking about the executive branch, the highest level of office which Islamists are able to impact. To understand the influence of Muslim Americans on this year's election, we really need to go back to 2016 and the Democratic primary between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. Despite the best prediction of pollsters, it turned out that Bernie Sanders, in large part due to support from Muslim Americans, ended up winning in Michigan and taking a key state away from Clinton. Now, you know, ultimately he ended up losing that election, but it was a lesson learned for Sanders, and he went on to apply that to the current election. It's important, of course, to note that Muslims make up less than 1% of the US population. So with such a small demographic, you would think that Muslims wouldn't have the punching power that they have in American elections. However, they tend to be situated in key battleground districts. They tend to live in largely Muslim majority communities where they, haven't assimilated with other neighborhoods. So that gives them sort of an oversized influence in both the federal election and down ballot races. So hoping to repeat his success, Sanders aggressively courted Islamists in the 2020 primaries. In 2019, he was the only major presidential candidate to attend ISNACON, which is the largest gathering of Muslim Americans sponsored by the Islamic Society of North America. ISNA, of course, was founded by members of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they're listed as an unindicted co-conspirator in a notorious Sharia financing trial. But Sanders pandered to Islamists in many other ways besides just showing up at an Islamist convention. He included no fewer than 8 Muslim American staffers on his campaign staff. He promised to reverse the Muslim ban during the first day of his administration. And he also committed to conditioning aid to Israel, America's closest ally in the Middle East. These pledges ended up earning him the endorsement of several major Islamist organizations, including groups like Engage and the Muslim Caucus of America. So there's some evidence that Sanders' strategy was successful in 2020. In Iowa, for instance, he sent campaign staff out to a number of mosques, which ended up serving as satellite caucuses, what they called them. Now, these caucuses ended up, the number of delegates that they were able to send to the Democratic National Convention would depend on the number of people who showed up and voted, as opposed to the larger caucuses in the state. Now, this gave Sanders an unexpected edge during the final moments while they were counting ballots. He unexpectedly performed better than expected, and he ended up closing the gap with Pete Buttigieg at the last moment to secure almost as many delegates as Buttigieg, who was the winner there. On Super Tuesday, exit polls showed that Sanders' performance was much better than other candidates. He secured nearly 60% of the Muslim American vote. 27% was given to Biden, and Elizabeth Warren, who sort of put together some last-ditch outreach efforts to Muslim Americans. She only secured 5% of the Muslim vote. So Sanders was unable, however, to repeat his early success in places like Iowa, where he ended up losing quite convincingly against his opponent, Joe Biden. Even in places like Michigan, he lost quite thoroughly, which kind of shows the limits of the Muslim vote, right? Despite their ability to organize, they are, after all, a small portion of the population. So in April, Sanders finally conceded the election to Joe Biden, but only after making a deal. He told Biden that he wanted to keep his name on the ballot, and he did this to send the maximum number of delegates to the Democratic National Convention in August. This allowed Bernie Sanders' ultra-progressive supporters, Islamists, to impact the Democratic Party platform by voting on it. And they were successful in some ways at convincing the Democratic Party to support an Islamist agenda. For instance, they were able to get Democrats to formally oppose the state efforts to prohibit the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which is aimed at economically and diplomatically isolating Israel. Now, they did this despite Joe Biden himself accusing BDS proponents of too often veering into anti-Semitism. So with Biden out of the race, Sanders out of the race, Biden began finally to see the importance of courting Islamists. He didn't put much effort into outreach with the Muslim community until Sanders bowed out, of course, because he knew that he controlled the majority of the Muslim vote. And we began to immediately see that Sanders was pandering to the Muslim vote. He did so, for instance, by editing a message to the Jewish American community, where he previously said that he would hold Palestinians accountable and not let them off the hook. He received a backlash for this, and he changed the wording to take this out completely. This was after Islamists reached his campaign and convinced him to do so. Also, his Muslim outreach coordinator, Amit Jani, he was a pro-Modi supporter of India. This upset quite a few Islamists and convinced Biden to demote Jani and replace him with Farouk Mitha as his Muslim outreach coordinator. Mitha belongs to a prominent organization known as Engage. So besides doing these things, Biden realized that he needed to speak to many Muslim Americans directly. He did this by appearing in virtual conferences for groups such as Engage. He appeared at ISNA despite not going there the year before. And just this month, he appeared at Muslim Advocates, which is a racial equity group for Muslim Americans. And he addressed that group as well. Let's see. So, despite these numerous appearances, though, Biden has been somewhat unsuccessful at convincing all Muslim Americans to support him. He, of course, isn't a Bernie Sanders, He doesn't take the hard line against Israel. He in fact calls himself a Zionist, and many Muslim Americans resent him for that. In fact, there's a small schism of sorts within the Islamist community among Palestinian activists and political opportunists from groups like Engage who support Biden despite his Zionist credentials. Finally, there's a smaller undercurrent of Muslim Americans and even Islamists who support the Republican candidate for higher office. They argue that conservatives are a better fit. They tend to agree with the Christian right on many issues, such as LBT issues and family values. And so, it remains to be seen how that has an effect going down the line. How all this plays out in the general election, we will see Muslim Americans respond to Islamist mobilization efforts and vote overwhelmingly in favor of Biden, or will he not be able to convince enough of them to show up for the general election? My best guess is that Biden lacks the pro-Islamist credentials of a Bernie Sanders, and he will be unable to mobilize Muslim voters in a meaningful way to get them to come out and truly impact Election Day. But of course, this remains to be seen. Our next speaker is our guest speaker, Dalia al-Aqidi from the Center for Security Policy. Dalia is going to speak to us about waging a counter-Islamist campaign against Representative Ilhan Omar in Minnesota's 5th District. Dalia, I leave it to you.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you so much for allowing me to share my own experience in Minneapolis. I call it the land of Islamism for several reasons. But before that, I would like to emphasize that being a Muslim has nothing to do with my own political affiliation or political identity. I was born in a Muslim family in Iraq, but I'm fiercely secular, and I refuse to follow the Sharia law or the Islamic religious law. I believe that this has no place in the United States of America. And that's why I moved here. And that's why I decided to come and fight against the Islamism and against the radical Islamists. I do respect people based on their on who they are. I do not view people based on their faith. Unfortunately, people like me have been silenced by the very same organizations that we've been hearing about and my colleagues have talked about. I decided to run for Congress because I believe that people like Ilhan Omar, like Rashida Tlaib, and many others who are supported by hardline Islamists are doing irreparable harm to their districts and to their states and to our country. And as an American, and especially as an immigrant and a Muslim, I felt it was my duty to try. I was inspired to launch my campaign because I believe that people in America need to hear from Americans like myself who are not afraid to call things by their actual names. I'm not afraid to denounce any terrorist act that is committed by a radical Islamist group around the globe. I'm not afraid of saying that what happened in 9/11 was a terrorist act committed by ruthless radical Islamists. They are not just some people, and what they did was not just something. I'm not afraid to say that Islamists in the United States, supported by the so-called Muslim NGOs under the pretext of defending Muslims and Arabs against all type of discrimination and defend their rights, such as care, these entities have tried and they succeeded in infiltrating our political system and our democracy to implement foreign agendas. I'm not going to apologize for these acts because I have nothing to do with that. Radical Islamists have been targeting secular Muslims like myself for ages. I did fight the extreme ideology when I was working in the Middle East, when I was working in Europe as a journalist, and even from the United States, and I'm still doing that. They go by different names. They go by different words, or they explain themselves differently, but at the end, they all belong to the Muslim Brotherhood. My race, and let me talk about my race, was extremely hard. I've experienced firsthand during my campaign days in Minneapolis, the damage that was done by the Islamists in the United States made it so hard for me, or so hard for people, secular Muslims, to gain the trust of the American people in general. I was faced with so many questions like, how can we trust you? How do we know that you're not different than Omar or Pleb? How would we know that if you get elected, you will not support the BDS movement or Hamas, for example? On the other hand, from the other side, I would get, how could we stand? How could you stand against your own people, against your own faith? How could you believe in a party that supports a ban against all Muslims, against your own family? Let me tell you, Islamists are very popular in the city of Minneapolis in particular, and in Minnesota in general. Here, Minnesota is extremely active in this area. The naked truth is, Islamists in this country would have nothing to do if they did not have the left support. Islamists could count on the left in media, and we all know how the mainstream media is, to constantly tell Muslims in the United States that America's racist, America's unjust, America's evil, Americans are horrible people. The right hates you and you cannot vote for the right and want to deport every single one of you. Be with us, vote for us, and you will be protected. Does this sound familiar to you guys? The Islamists have to do very little when they have that kind of help from the mainstream media. The fact is that it became very difficult for the average mosque-goer to fight this narrative. Once institutions have been taken over by Islamists, it's very, very hard to dislodge them. The Muslim Brotherhood wants the Muslim to believe that any attack on them is a straight attack on Islam, which is very inaccurate. You see it when opponents are called Islamophobes, white supremacists, racist. How ironic that someone came from the Middle East, I have Middle Eastern origins, I'm an immigrant, a former refugee, and a Muslim, could be accused of being a white supremacist. I think this is outrageous. Fans of Omar and fans of Pleb on the left have no idea who are getting themselves into bed with. They're making their own choice. In America today, more Muslims need to speak out everywhere, but unfortunately, the mainstream media does not listen to people like me. My last point is, I don't want to take a long time. It's not hard to spot an Islamist candidate or an Islamist politician. Just ask yourself, is that person endorsed by an organization like CARE? Do these people promote narrative or grievance against the society? Are they claiming to be a victim? America needs to realize that the vital difference between being a Muslim and being an Islamist, and it's our duty to advocate and raise awareness in our country. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Dalia. Appreciate you. We are now going to go into the question portion, questions from the moderator, myself, where I'm going to ask a single question of each of our panelists. Greg Roman, I will start with you. I wanted to know, you talked about a number of different ways that Qatar influences American elections. How much money are we talking about overall? And is it unprecedented from Qatar, this amount of money, and from any nation in general? Greg, you're muted, I'm sorry.
My apologies, Ben. In 2018, Qatar had the most amount of lobbyists, of PR companies, and the most amount of money spent of any Middle Eastern country trying to influence the United States. Now, just some fascinating, a little bit scary, frightening statistics in terms of their operations. So Qatar has Al Jazeera. They had over 100 reporters with congressional credentials, according to the Senate press office, where the Washington Post and New York Times had less credentialed reporters in Washington, D.C. than Al Jazeera did. Now you can imagine what these reporters were doing in terms of their activity on Capitol Hill. More than that, they have a sports network that they use called BN Sports. They purchase for billions of dollars, where every hour after a soccer game or any other global sports broadcast that's being put on, they talk a little bit about the political minute or 3 minutes of world review, broadcasting pro-regime snippets and propaganda. And beyond that, their targeted influence operations against the American Jewish community, which took place in 2017 and 2018, tried to manipulate center-right American Zionists and pro-Israel, I want to say Zionists because it was both pro-Israel Christians and pro-Israel Jews, into trying to sell a message that it was okay for Qatar to be in a relationship with the United States, even though Qatar has helped facilitating Iran's skirting of American sanctions. They're one of the main financiers of Hamas. They're one of the main backers of Turkey. And when the U.S. tried to sanction Turkey in 2018 for its capture of Andrew Parsons, the American pastor who was being held as a political prisoner, America put sanctions in Qatar on June of that year. America put sanctions on Turkey in June of that year on their sanction and aluminum tariffs that were put on. Qatar immediately responded with a $15 billion loan to help the Turkish currency stay afloat, to, in one way or another, mitigate the effects of those sanctions. Qatar is a bad actor against American interests, and they try to ameliorate their agenda in the Middle East by spending tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars here in the United States to buy goodwill from politicians, from the media, and their friends, including those that we think of being supporters of our agenda here in our communities.
Thank you, Greg. My next question is for Sam Westrop. Sam, you talked about you told us that Islamists were funding both the left, mainly the left, and the right, and that they find a number of unique ways to cover up their donations, or at least hide the sources of these donations. How can Americans improve transparency laws so we can figure out, we can get an exact fix on how much Islamists are influencing American elections?
Yes, good question. I was remiss not to mention earlier that we don't believe the figures I presented are necessarily the full picture. We're certainly not aware of every Islamist in the United States. We can't check their names against the FEC if we don't know their names. There are other ways, though, to hide campaign contributions. And one method that is frequently cited by critics of the current campaign finance system, at least on the federal level, is that donations can be hidden by using law firms. Money passed from organizations to their attorneys, covered by client-attorney confidentiality. The law firm can then pass it on, either donate that themselves or pass it on to another client of theirs to donate. In other words, it becomes very difficult to tell the original source of the money for a lot of campaign contributions. We went through around 4,500 organizations in the United States and checked their legal fees, declared legal fees in their most recent tax returns. There are about 50 organizations who spend well over $50,000 on legal fees a year, despite not being involved in any criminal or civil lawsuits at the time. That's suspicious, at least to us. This is entirely anecdotal. We cannot prove this money is being used to ultimately being used to influence campaigns. It is very telling that the top organizations by legal spending, who are, again, not involved in any apparent litigation, are all affiliated with, or almost all affiliated with, the Turkish regime. It does seem possible to me, and again, I stress possible, that the problems of campaign finance law are being exploited by supporters of the Ankara regime, the Erdogan regime. You asked what we can do to fix this. Well, for a start, close this loophole. This is obviously a massive a very easy way, really, for organizations to influence elections. I know it's by far not the only problem with the current state of federal financing, and after weeks of studying it, I'm pretty despairing of the entire system, to be honest. But yeah, there's a lot of suspicious stuff going on here. I don't think we'll ever truly know the actual total amount of money that is going into US elections from Islamist sources. We can only get a glimpse from the methods we can that I've described and that we've used. Who knows what the total figure is?
Thank you, Sam. And my final question goes to Dalia al-Aqidi. Dalia, there was a recent ballot harvesting scandal in Minnesota involving the Democratic Party there. Your opponent was accused of hiring operatives to convince elderly voters to fill out ballots to support her campaign. Do you think that this had a measurable effect on the overall results of the primary there?
Definitely. I mean, this is what we know so far, what they're doing here in Minneapolis, especially in the 5th District and in Minnesota. What they're doing is they're trying to, they bully their own people. People are too scared. And let me talk about the Somalis themselves, even though they're about 70,000. Just 70,000, but they bully their own people. If anybody speaks from the Somali community and from the Muslim community, because they're all controlled by CARE Minnesota and by other small mosques with their own imams, that they are too afraid to even speak up. They are afraid of their own, I mean, they could get killed. So definitely Ilhan and co. With CARE, of course, and other groups are suppressing the voices of other Muslims in this area and in this state, and bullying everybody. And it's very hard for anybody and from the Muslim community in this states to voice their concern, because they'll be attacked and they'll be probably threatened. I mean, even my work after here as a journalist became extremely hard after I announced my candidacy, and throughout my the last 6-7 months. I can't do any work here because the left here in Minneapolis, they don't even want to talk to me because they figured out, oh, you are the enemy. So it's very hard for me to do a story on anybody. I cannot talk to the Somalis because you have a small group of Somalis that are against Ilhan Omar. They're afraid for their lives. And I know, in fact, 3-4 people that they had to leave and go to hiding somewhere else until the elections. So definitely it's very hard to get the truth from the Somaliland, from the land of Islamism here in Minnesota and Minneapolis especially.
Thank you, Dalia. Okay, during our final 10 minutes, we're going to take a few questions from our audience. Our first question comes from Carrie Hillebrand. She asks, what drove Sanders' need to align himself with noxious anti-Semitic Islamists? Was it that he saw this as the best vehicle to burnish his liberal credentials, or was there a deeper, perhaps more ominous reason? Definitely to the first, I believe that is true. Progressives, the ultra-progressive left from which Sanders comes, definitely views the Arab-Israeli conflict as a settler colonial issue within an intersectionalist prism. And especially with racial justice becoming such a prominent issue in the US today, they're able to portray Palestinians as a minority, and as a minority, they, have been oppressed by the Israeli government. And so, that issue tends to work with Sanders on many levels with all of his supporters. Is there a more ominous reason for that? I don't know. I think that there's part of Islamists. Islamists have been very successful, I think, at convincing many American lawmakers, especially on the left, that their anti-Semitism is in fact anti-Zionism, that they are merely opposed to Zionism and the state of Israel and the tactics it uses. So, I don't think that anything was purposely done by by the Sanders campaign to, recruit anti-Semites, but it's definitely on him to become aware of who he's dealing with. And the numerous organizations that he worked with have a history of working with anti-Semite speakers, providing platforms for anti-Semites, working with mosques, which are anti-Jewish. So, I think we need to hold our lawmakers accountable to being very well aware of who they're working with.
Ben, could I ask that Sam or you comment on the tape that we were able to obtain about a former director of outreach for either the Sanders campaign or might have been for Tlaib or for Omar, where he said that working with progressives is a means to an end. Can you elaborate on that, either Sam or Ben? Do you know what I'm talking about? At the ISNA conference?
Yes. This is a current Islamist politician, I think, from New Jersey. He made it pretty explicit, as Greg just pointed out, that the alliance of the left is a temporary one. It's a tactical thing to advance Islamist interests. The unsaid implication being that at some point the left will be cast off and the true colors of Islamism will be revealed. You can find this quote for yourself on the Middle East Forum if you go to the Islamist Watch project. We've written about this quite a bit. This is not the only example. We've been cataloging discussion within the Muslim community about the alliance of the left between those who see it as an important tactical alliance and those who think that Islamists have gone too far and they're diluting Islam. And then there are those, and this is a tiny bit of a tangent, but worth just mentioning, there are those who fear that Islamists have spent so long speaking the language of the left that they've accidentally indoctrinated their own children to believe that somehow Islamism and gay rights go hand in hand genuinely. And that now you have these, the now branches of the Council on American Islamic Relations are staffed by young hijab-wearing supporters of transgender rights petitions and watchers of AJ+, I point out. So there is this extraordinary politics within the Muslim community over this question, and I undoubtedly believe it will lead to a split, a very severe split at some point in the future.
I'd like to endorse Ben Baird's work and also what Dalia, who did an analysis for the Middle East Forum on the Somali American community in Minnesota. That's a report that I hope we can release soon. And Ben, can you just give a 15 to 20 second overview of what you do with SIG in terms of monitoring local Islamism?
Yeah, absolutely. The counter-Islamist grid is concerned with countering and exposing Islamists at the local level in select cities throughout North America. This is not just done, of course, politically, but it's done by looking at education, by looking at the influence of local religious leaders. Recently in Minnesota, this was actually the Islamism and Politics project, but we were able to take a look at a group called Isaiah, which is a federation of churches, progressive churches, which have aligned with some of the most radical mosques in the state to influence local elections and to get their congregations to vote for their approved candidates.
Okay. Sorry for the interruption, Ben. Why don't we?
No. Certainly. Okay, so going on, question 2. This comes from David Funke. Apologies if I pronounce it incorrectly. Did you note money and involvement from donors who are not Islamist but secularist, or donors who happen to be Muslim? This is for Sam.
Yes, either because we are tracking these people anyway, because we like their work, or because we're unsure where they fall within the spectrum of Islam to Islamism, or because they were false positive matches and got into the data. I did examine where we identified those. I did examine their activity separately. It fits a broader democratic pattern: support for initially for Sanders, then for Biden, and now for local Democrats around the country. It's nothing particularly out of the ordinary. Again, notable increase in support for Republican candidates compared to years past. Apart from that, yes, it mirrors the rest of the country.
Great. In the final 5 minutes here, our third question goes to Dalia, al-Aqidi. Did you have the support of the Jewish community in your campaign against Ilhan Omar? This question comes from Len Getz.
I have to say that I withdrew my candidacy back in June for several reasons that are too long to talk. Well, it depends. The left Jews, the liberal Jews, definitely, I had no support from them, and I will never get, or any secular Muslim would never get, if that Muslim is a Republican, will never get the support of the liberal Jews. Definitely, yes, certain sectors in the Jewish community supported me, not only here but worldwide. I've spoken a few times back in DC in certain events, but it's not about me as a person. It's about the idea, and it's about how do secular Muslims like myself, who don't care about their faith, they care about their citizenship, they care about their loyalty to the country. How could we survive under the umbrella of terrorism, of Islamism that is killing all of us? And I'm talking now, I'm not saying killing literally, but there are shadow banning everybody else, and this is a huge burden on us, especially the seculars that are trying to do something good for this country.
Certainly. And to segue off of that, this question's for Greg. Help me understand why most of the Jewish public in the US still votes for the Democratic Party. I think there was a recent poll that showed as much as 75%, maybe more, plan to vote for Biden.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, listen, there is a history going back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt of American Jewish community support overwhelmingly for Democrat candidates. Even when Jimmy Carter was not seen as the most favorable president towards the American Jewish community and its interests in the 1980 election with Ronald Reagan, he still got a majority of the votes. It goes back to an intertwining of three things. One is what I would call fiercely liberal values that emanated out of the Haskalah and sort of the age of Jewish enlightenment that came in the 1800s and the early 1900s when massive Jewish immigration came to the United States. The second is seeing Democrat presidents up until I'd say about Bill Clinton, where they had maybe with the exception of Jimmy Carter, largely friendly support for Israel, the Jewish state of Israel. And the third is sort of this sort of cognitive dissonance where some Jewish Americans see their political domestic priorities in totality rather than being what might call 1, 2, or 3 issue voters. But let's not be mistaken. There are Jewish Americans who are at the highest echelons of the Trump administration, and there were Jewish Americans that are the highest echelons of the
Greg, you've frozen out there during the final seconds there. I just want to ask one more question. Sam, if you could answer in the next 15 seconds. I'd like to know more about Islamist penetration of the Department of Defense and other federal agencies of the US. Is this happening on a wide level? And if so, what's going on?
Yes, and in some ways it's got worse under the Trump administration. I actually maintain that the Trump administration has been fantastic for Islamists, both because Islamists have become part of the opposition to Trump. They help run the legal challenges, they lead the protests. That's not the Trump administration's fault. What is the Trump administration's fault is the habit of federal officials partnering with Islamists, funding Islamists, and appearing at Islamist events. Over $10 million under Trump has gone into Islamist pockets, including to groups tied to Hamas, tied to the Muslim Brotherhood, tied to Jamaat-e-Islami, a very prominent South Asian Islamist group. Federal officials appear at Islamist fundraisers. FEMA just put out a few videos, that's the Federal Emergency Management Agency, just put out some videos openly promoting these Islamist charities that are currently being investigated in Europe for terror ties and extremism. The Trump administration has not been good on the subject, not at all, perhaps at odds with people's expectations, given Trump's rhetoric. I anticipate it won't get better under Biden, especially with the number of Islamists involved in this campaign. Yeah, this is a serious problem.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. Thank you to our audience for tuning in and watching us. I want to, of course, thank both Sam Westrop and Greg Roman for their oversight and mentorship of the Islamism and Politics Project. I want to thank Dr. Daniel Pipes, of course, Without him, this panel would not have been possible today. Stacy Broman, the development coordinator of the Middle East Forum, who helped organize this event and put it all together for us. Thank you for watching us today as we cover Islamism in the US 2020 elections. Stay tuned to the Middle East Forum and Islamist Watch in the coming weeks. We have a number of articles that we can point out that we will be publishing that cover the elections in more detail. Thank you.